Senator, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Robert.
With the Ebola situation with a patient here in Texas that just died, what do you think has been the public health response to that, your reaction to that?
Well, I know people are very concerned, and I'm very concerned that there's not been adequate screening of passengers traveling from West Africa to the United States. And so I've written to the Customs and Border Patrol Commissioner and asking for an update on more aggressive measures to screen people infected with the virus. The good news is that right now it can only be transmitted by bodily fluids, and given the proper protocols and procedures, such as we've seen observed here in Dallas, it should be contained. But certainly there's a concern long term that this virus can replicate and eventually become airborne, which would be very, very serious.
Just within the last hours we're taping this, federal officials have said they were going to begin temperature screenings of passengers coming in from West Africa at 5 different airports, first at JFK, hopefully within this weekend.
Right.
Is that enough of a response, do you think?
Well, I noticed that there wasn't any Texas airport like the George Bush Airport in Houston or the DFW Airport in the Metroplex. And I'd be concerned about that, because the problem is there are no direct flights from West Africa into the United States, but they go through these other airports and then come on indirectly. And so I think there needs to be additional screening precautions taken at other airports. I don't think we can be too careful.
Senator, why should Texans support you for another term?
Well, I've tried to do a good job on their behalf, and I think I've pretty much fit our great state. I'm a traditional conservative, somebody who believes in limited government, lower taxes, reasonable regulation, and the free enterprise system. The great news is that people are voting with their feet to come to Texas, because this is where opportunity exists. And a lot of that has to do with our energy sector, but a lot of it has to do with just the attitude that our elected officials from the governor on down have had. And that attitude, I think, is best personified by asking the question, how can we make it easier for the job creator to do what you do best, to create jobs, to help people find work and provide for their family and pursue their dream? In Washington these days, it seems like the opposite, or the converse of that question is asked, which is, how can we make it harder? And unfortunately, we're reaping the results of that with very slow economic growth and still high unemployment, and the highest percentage of people who've simply left the workforce in the last 35 years.
We see a lot of polls, people who are very frustrated with members of the Senate and the House, and of course you've been there for a while. Should people be frustrated with you?
Well, I'm frustrated too, because the Senate is not working, and it's no secret that public opinion holds Congress in very low regard. What I'd like to do is get back to work and make Congress work for the American people. We've simply had the most dysfunctional Senate in American history. 380 plus bills passed the House of Representatives that have been simply died in the Senate, because the majority leader made the calculation that he needed to protect vulnerable incumbents from tough votes. Well, if you don't want to take tough votes, you really need it to belong in another line of work, because that's the nature of the job. So I'm anxious to get to work and help move legislation that helps Texans and the American people and gets our economy moving again and helps create jobs.
You are comfortably ahead in the polls I've seen, but the Democrats here in Texas want to turn our state blue, and they think they will eventually do that through demographics, if nothing else. What's your response to that?
Well, I don't think it's an imminent threat. In other words, I don't think it's going to happen this year, but I do take it seriously, which is why we've have websites in English, Spanish, Vietnamese, Chinese, and Hindi. I was one of the co-founders of the U.S.-India Caucus, and we are home to about 300,000 plus Indian Americans who are very accomplished people, highly educated, very strong family orientation. Along with our Hispanics and Asian Americans in Texas, this represents our growth potential, I think, for conservatives and for Republicans. But they won't vote for our candidates if we don't show up and if we don't explain how our principles will help them pursue their dreams. And I've tried to do that in this campaign, and I'm certainly going to try to continue it, because you're right. If we just rely on the same old block of voters that look like me, we're going to find ourselves in the minority.
We've seen many conservatives come out and blast these Supreme Court rulings on the gay marriage bans. Senator Cruz has called it tragic and indefensible. What's your view?
Well, I'm a strong believer in traditional marriage. At the same time, I recognize that our Constitution was written for people who don't necessarily believe in all the same things I do. And so my hope is the Supreme Court will allow the states, like the state of Texas, to choose traditional marriage and not impose its will from unelected judges.
We don't hear a lot about the budget deficit, the national debt, over, I think, $18 trillion right now. It's kind of faded as an issue, but it's still there. What is the nation going to do to get that down?
Well, two things are for sure, Robert. Somebody's going to have to pay the money back. And the interest rates on the debt are not going to be as low as they are now because of what the Federal Reserve has done. So this is a long-term threat to our economic security. It's a long-term threat to our national security. The former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, when asked what the single biggest threat to national security was, he said the debt, because he realizes with less money and with fiscal vulnerability that less money is going to be committed to our military and to our defense. And as we've seen here recently, particularly with the president calling for increased airstrikes and to degrade and destroy ISIL, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, unfortunately, this is still a very dangerous world. So we need to get to work and get to work soon. I support a constitutional amendment that requires a balanced budget.
Do you support the president's approach to the way he's fighting ISIL right now?
Well, I think it's a good start, but all of his generals, including here most recently Leon Panetta, his former Secretary of Defense, and Robert Gates, the previous Secretary of Defense, have said that you can't do it without boots on the ground. This is the hard reality. They don't have to be American boots on the ground, but they have to be somebody's boots. And unfortunately, the United States being the preeminent military force in the world, nobody can really fill that gap that is left by an American void. So I agree with the president that this is a threat not just to the region but to the homeland as well, because the whole goal in Afghanistan and Iraq was to deny safe haven to terrorist organizations like ISIL, previously Al-Qaeda, that would threaten us here at home, which we found out could happen and did happen on 9/11. So I agree it's a big threat, and I wish we had we're in Congress now, I wish we were still in session debating the strategy and the size and the scope of our national commitment to this effort along with our allies. Unfortunately, we're not doing that because the powers that be said we needed a recess so vulnerable incumbents could go run for re-election rather than take care of that important business.
Do you think Republicans are going to take the Senate?
I'm pretty optimistic about it, but I have to confess I'm this close to an election. I'm nervous as a cat, but I do think it's important. And while I think Republicans need to make the sale, I think right now what we have is people who are disappointed in the Democratic leadership in the Senate and at the White House, and now they're willing to listen to what are my other choices. And so that gives us an opening and an opportunity to make the sale in the sense that explaining how our policies, how our approach would be more beneficial to the economy and jobs and national security.
Would you like to be the next Senate Majority Leader?
You know, I would like to be the next in the majority, and I would be happy to be the next Majority Whip. I'm currently the Minority Whip, which is basically the chief vote counter on the Republican side, working very closely with our Republican leader, Mitch McConnell. I expect he will be returned, and he'll be the next Majority Leader. 2016
presidential race, who do you like? Who would you vote for?
Well, we're going to have a few Texans, I think, and people that were born here, like Rand Paul, but who's really from Kentucky. So it's looking like Governor Perry and Senator Cruz are going to make a run for it. But we're going to have, I think, a big field. I saw today that somebody said we could have as many as 15 people running. I just hope it's not as drawn out as the last one was, because I think it was harmful to our nominee, Governor Romney. He came out of that primary, I think, bloodied and damaged, and made it harder for him to compete in the general election. So I think there are a number of governors. You know, Jeb Bush's name still being tossed around, Chris Christie, John Kasich from Ohio, Scott Walker, from Wisconsin. I think we're going to have a lot of good choices. And it looks like we're in for another coronation of Hillary Clinton on the Democratic side, but I'm not sure the American people really want a coronation. They're going to want a vigorous contest and a competition of ideas. And so I'm optimistic, but the first thing we have to do is get the majority in 27 or 8 days now, in the next 4 weeks. And then we need to show we can govern responsibly. And then we can reach out, as I said earlier, to people who are unaffiliated, who are not necessarily Republicans or conservatives, and do a better job of making the case why our principles are better for them in their pursuit of the American dream.
Senator John Cornyn, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Robert.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.